My father's hypocrisy backfired when I discovered the family's dirty laundry in an old letter, but I didn't give up, and everything started spinning with renewed vigor. And then, growing up in my family, there were always two rules. Don't embarrass the family, and do as your father says. My dad, Jack, wasn't just the head of the family. He was its self-appointed moral compass. He loved to say things like, "We don't throw stones unless we're prepared to stand in a glass house." It sounded profound when I was a kid, but the older I got, the more it felt like an excuse for his self-righteous attitude. Dad's life revolved around rules and appearances. He'd hold court at the dinner table, lecturing us on discipline, integrity, and loyalty. I'd sit there, nodding while picking at my plate, trying to avoid his razor-sharp judgment. My mom, Rachel, was the quieter enforcer, standing by his side but rarely challenging him. Then there was my younger sister, Ava. At 16, Ava had mastered the art of deflection, smiling sweetly while keeping her head down. She had learned early on that rebellion wasn't worth the fight. And then there was me, Mason. I'm 22, fresh out of college, and trying to figure out my next step. My dad doesn't get that figuring it out phase. In his mind, a real man knows what he wants, goes after it, and never makes excuses. He never let me forget how he started his own business at 24 and had it booming by 30. Comparisons were his specialty. Last weekend, Dad's latest rant was about Noah, my best friend since 3rd grade. Noah was couch surfing after a breakup and was crashing at my place for a bit. "You can't let freeloaders dictate your life, Mason," Dad warned, staring me down as if I was Noah's personal sponsor. "You're not responsible for other people's failures." Hypocrisy was Jack's favorite sport, and he played it well. That day, I needed space, so I volunteered to help clear out the attic. It was mostly forgotten junk. Old photo albums, mismatched holiday decorations, and random boxes labeled in Dad's neat handwriting. Then, tucked under a stack of dusty books, I found a small wooden box. It looked out of place, almost too delicate for the clutter surrounding it. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and found a stack of letters bound together with a faded blue ribbon. On top was a single envelope, yellowed with age. The handwriting on it wasn't Dad's, but it was addressed to him. "Jack, my love," it began. My heart skipped a beat. My dad isn't exactly a romantic, and I'd never seen him save anything sentimental like this. The signature at the bottom read Grace. I didn't recognize the name. Who the hell was Grace? I debated for a second. This felt like snooping, but the letter was right there. The curiosity was too much to resist. I unfolded the delicate paper and started reading. The letter was dated 1999, the year before I was born. Grace talked about how much she missed him, how she couldn't wait to see him again. She mentioned something about promises they made to each other and how much she still believed in them. But the part that shook me came near the end. "Jack, I know we made the decision together, but it's tearing me apart. I think about our child every day. Please tell me it was the right thing to do." I reread the sentence 3 times, each word punching me harder than the last. Their child. What decision? My brain raced as I pieced together what little information I had. If this letter was real, and it seemed real, then my dad had a past I never knew about. A past that involved someone named Grace and a child. The sound of Ava yelling from downstairs startled me. "Mason, are you even helping, or are you just up there hiding?" I quickly folded the letter and put it back in the box, stuffing the whole thing under a pile of books. My mind was spinning, but I couldn't let anyone see it. Not yet. That night at dinner, I couldn't stop staring at my dad. He was the same as ever, going on about some neighbor's messy divorce and how people needed to take responsibility for their actions. I looked over at my mom, Rachel, who nodded absent-mindedly as she spooned mashed potatoes onto Ava's plate. Did she know? Was she part of this? I couldn't tell. My appetite was gone, and Ava was texting under the table, probably tuning Dad out like usual. I sat there, holding my fork, wondering how many lies were woven into the fabric of the life we called a family. That letter, it wasn't just a crack in the glass. It was a rock, and I had a feeling it was about to shatter everything. I couldn't sleep that night. The words from Grace's letter played on repeat in my head like a broken record. Our child. I tried to convince myself that maybe I was misinterpreting it, But the deeper I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't some casual fling my dad had before he met my mom. This was serious, life-altering serious. And it wasn't just his life anymore. It was ours too. I spent the next day trying to act normal. Ava had a soccer game, and Mom was busy organizing some fundraiser for her book club. Dad was working in his office, probably bossing people around on the phone. The perfect suburban family routine. I could barely stand it. Every interaction felt fake, like I was part of some sitcom where everyone smiled while pretending nothing was wrong. By mid-afternoon, I cracked. I couldn't just let this sit in my head without doing something. I headed back to the attic, pretending I needed to grab an old textbook. The wooden box was right where I'd left it, buried under the same stack of books. My hands were shaking as I opened it again. The rest of the letters were still tied together with the blue ribbon. I hesitated for a moment before untying it. The letters spanned about 3 years, from 1998 to early 2001. I skimmed through them, piecing together the story. Grace wasn't just some fling. She and my dad were in love. She wrote about how they dreamed of starting a life together, but something, or someone, got in the way. She hinted at arguments, at pressure from outside forces, but never said exactly what had happened. And then, in the last letter, dated February 2001, Grace wrote, "I hope you're happy now, Jack. I can't keep waiting for you to choose me. I'll always love you, but I deserve better. I deserve someone who isn't afraid of his own heart." That letter felt like a gut punch. Whoever Grace was, she had loved my dad enough to wait for him through whatever mess they were in, and he'd walked away. I didn't want to feel bad for her. After all, this was my dad we were talking about, but I couldn't help it. She sounded heartbroken. And the part about their child? She never mentioned it again, as if she'd buried it along with the rest of their relationship. I spent hours in the attic that afternoon, trying to make sense of everything. Why had my dad never mentioned Grace? What happened to their child? Did my mom know about any of this? By the time I heard Ava calling for dinner, I felt like I was drowning in questions with no answers. That evening, I couldn't sit through another one of Dad's lectures. I excused myself from the table halfway through dinner, mumbling something about feeling sick. I could tell he wasn't happy about it. He hated disruptions to his routine, but I didn't care. I needed to talk to someone, and there was only one person I trusted with something this big. Noah was sitting on my couch when I got back to my place. He'd just come back from a job interview and was flipping through Netflix. "Yo, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said, sitting up. I didn't waste time. "Dude, I found something insane in my parents' attic," I said, pacing the room. "Like, life-changing insane." "Okay," he said, leaning forward. "Spill." I told him everything, about the letter, about Grace, about the child. I expected him to be shocked, maybe even tell me I was overreacting. Instead, he sat there, nodding slowly, like he was piecing it together alongside me. "Mason, you know what this means, right?" he said finally. I stopped pacing. "That my dad's a hypocrite?" "Yeah, I got that part." "No, I mean, if this kid exists, if Grace actually had the baby, then you might have a sibling out there." The thought hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just about uncovering my dad's past anymore. This was bigger. This was about someone who might actually exist, someone who could be part of my family. "You think he knows?" I asked. "About the kid, I mean." Noah shrugged. "I don't know, man. But there's only one way to find out." The next day, I decided I couldn't sit on this any longer. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to confront my dad. I waited until after dinner, when he was sitting in the living room with the TV on and his laptop open. My mom was in the kitchen, and Ava had gone upstairs to FaceTime her friends. It was as private a moment as I was going to get. "Dad, can I talk to you about something?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "What's up?" "It's about the attic," I said, sitting down across from him. "I found something up there the other day." That got his attention. He closed the laptop and looked at me, his expression curious but wary. "What do you mean? What did you find?" I hesitated, but there was no turning back now. "I found a box of letters. From someone named Grace." For a split second, I saw something flash across his face. Shock, maybe, or fear. But he recovered quickly, his expression hardening. You had no business going through my things, Mason. They were in the attic, I said, my voice rising. What was I supposed to do? Pretend I didn't see them? He stood up, towering over me. You were supposed to respect my privacy. Privacy? I shot back, standing too. You've been preaching about integrity and honesty my whole life, and you're hiding this? Who is Grace, Dad? And what happened to your child? The room went silent. For a moment, I thought he might actually answer me, but then he shook his head and turned away. This conversation is over, he said, walking toward his office. Dad, wait. I called after him, but he slammed the door shut behind him. I stood there, my heart pounding. He'd shut me down so fast, like it was nothing, like I was nothing. I heard my mom come into the room behind me, her footsteps soft. Mason, she said quietly, what's going on? I turned to her, my frustration boiling over. Did you know? About Grace? About the kid? Her face went pale. She looked down, avoiding my gaze. That was all the confirmation I needed. Unbelievable, I muttered, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. I ended up at Noah's again, pacing his living room like a caged animal. He wouldn't even talk to me, I said, throwing my hands in the air. And my mom, she knew. I could see it in her face. Noah was leaning against the kitchen counter, watching me. So what now? I don't know, I admitted. But I can't just let this go. There's more to this story, and I'm going to find out what it is. Noah nodded, his expression serious. Then we'll figure it out together. For the first time all day, I felt a sliver of relief. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I wasn't alone in this. And I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered the truth. I didn't go home that night. I crashed on Noah's couch instead, my mind racing with what little I knew and all the things I didn't. My dad's refusal to talk, my mom's guilty expression, and the looming shadow of Grace and her letter haunted me. By the time morning rolled around, I knew I couldn't let this sit any longer. If my dad wouldn't talk to me, maybe someone else would. Noah woke up around 9, groggy but ready to help. What's the plan today, Sherlock? He asked, rubbing his eyes. First, I need to figure out who Grace is, or was, I said. She's the key to all of this. And how do you plan on doing that? It's not like she left a forwarding address in those letters. I sat down with my laptop, pulling up every search engine I could think of. The name Grace wasn't exactly uncommon, but I had a couple of clues to narrow it down. The time frame, the connection to my dad, and the fact that she seemed to know my family well. After hours of digging, I hit a wall. Either Grace had disappeared from the planet, or she'd been really good at keeping her life private. Noah leaned over my shoulder, scrolling through the same dead-end results. Maybe you're looking in the wrong place. If Grace was this important to your dad, someone else in your family might know about her. The idea hit me like a light bulb. Lauren, I said, sitting up straight. My dad's younger sister was the closest thing our family had to a loose cannon. She'd always been the rebel, the one who didn't buy into Dad's perfectionist worldview. If anyone had dirt on him, it was her. I drove over to Lauren's place that afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel like a lifeline. Lauren lived about half an hour away in a cozy little house with her husband, Matt. They didn't have kids, but their house always felt warm and inviting, probably because Lauren didn't share Dad's obsession with appearances. She was the fun aunt, the one who let Ava and me stay up late watching horror movies when we were kids. When I knocked on the door, Lauren answered in her usual jeans and flannel shirt, her auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail. Mason, this is a surprise, she said, ushering me inside. What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost. I didn't waste time. I need to ask you about someone named Grace. Her expression froze, the easy smile vanishing from her face. For a moment, I thought she might deny knowing anything, but then she let out a sigh and gestured for me to sit down. Where did you hear that name? She asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Her tone was cautious, but there was something else there too, something like sadness. I found some letters in the attic, I said, from her to Dad. She talked about a child, about decisions they made together. I need to know what happened. Lauren sat across from me, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. I always wondered if Jack would come clean about Grace someday, she said softly. But I guess I shouldn't be surprised he didn't. I leaned forward. So it's true? He was with her? They had a kid? Lauren nodded slowly. Grace and Jack were together for a long time, longer than most people realize. They were engaged, actually, before he met your mom. Engaged? My voice cracked on the word. This was bigger than I'd imagined. They were young, Lauren continued, but they were crazy about each other. Grace was, well, she was everything Jack wasn't. She was kind, spontaneous, didn't care what people thought. I think that scared him. He loved her, but he couldn't control her. And when things got complicated, he did what Jack always does. He ran. Complicated how? I asked, my stomach nodding. Lauren hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. Grace got pregnant. Jack wasn't ready to be a father, and our parents, let's just say they didn't approve. They convinced him it would ruin his future. Grace wanted to keep the baby, but Jack sided with them. She gave the baby up for adoption. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. So the child, my sibling, they're out there somewhere? Yes, Lauren said. A little boy. He'd be about 23 now. The timeline hit me like a sledgehammer. A sibling, an older brother I never knew existed. And Grace? I asked. What happened to her? She left, Lauren said, her voice heavy. She couldn't forgive Jack for what he did. Last I heard, she moved to California, but that was years ago. We lost touch. I sat back, my head spinning. My dad had spent my entire life preaching about responsibility and integrity, but he'd abandoned the woman he loved and their child to protect his reputation. The hypocrisy was staggering. When I got home, I found my mom in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up when I walked in, her face a mixture of relief and worry. You've been gone all day, she said. Your dad's been asking about you. Good, I said, tossing my keys on the counter. Because I need to talk to him. My mom put down the knife, her shoulders tensing. Mason, whatever you're planning. I'm planning to get the truth, I interrupted. No more lies, Mom. No more pretending everything's fine. Before she could respond, I marched into the living room, where my dad was watching the news. He looked up, his expression unreadable. Mason, he said, his tone cautious. Where have you been? Talking to Aunt Lauren, I said, crossing my arms. She told me everything. The color drained from his face. He set the remote down slowly, his jaw tightening. What exactly did she tell you? About Grace. About the baby you gave up. About how you abandoned them both to protect your precious reputation. Watch your tone, he snapped, his voice rising. You don't know what you're talking about. I know enough, I shot back. I know you've been lying to us for years. You've been judging everyone else while hiding the biggest mistake of your own life. How do you justify that, Dad? My mom appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Jack, is it true? She asked, her voice trembling. Is what Mason's saying true? For a moment, my dad looked like he might deny it. But then he let out a heavy sigh and sank back into his chair. Yes, he said quietly. It's true. The room went silent. I could see the tears welling in my mom's eyes, the betrayal written all over her face. Ava came down the stairs, drawn by the shouting. What's going on? She asked, looking between us. You want to tell her? I asked, glaring at my dad. You want to tell Ava how you abandoned your first child because he didn't fit into your perfect little plan? Mason, that's enough, my mom said, but there was no conviction in her voice. My dad looked at Ava, his expression full of regret. It was a long time ago, he said, before I met your mother. I was young and stupid, and I made mistakes. But everything I've done since then has been for this family, for you, for us. I laughed bitterly. You mean for yourself? You're a coward, Dad. You always have been. With that, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from him, from all of it. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I drove aimlessly around town, replaying the confrontation with my dad over and over in my head. Every time I thought about his excuses, about the hollow everything I've done has been for this family line, my anger boiled over. I had spent my whole life trying to live up to his impossible standards, only to find out he'd been hiding behind a mask the entire time. By the time I pulled into Noah's driveway, the sun was starting to rise. I knocked on the door, hoping he wouldn't mind me crashing for a bit longer. He answered with bedhead and a groggy expression, but he waved me inside without asking questions. "Rough night?" he asked, handing me a glass of water. I sat on the couch, staring at the floor. "You have no idea." I spent the next couple of days lying low, avoiding my parents and trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to confront my dad again, force him to give me more answers. But I knew that would only lead to more arguments, more stonewalling. If I was going to get the truth, I needed to dig deeper, and I knew exactly where to start. On the third day, I called Lauren. "Mason," she said when she answered, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you again. Do you still have any contact info for Grace?" I asked. "Anything that might help me find her?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mason, are you sure you want to go down this road? It's not going to be easy." "I don't care," I said. "I need to know the truth." Lauren sighed. "I don't have much," she admitted, "but I think I still have an old address for her. She moved to California years ago, but maybe it's a starting point." She gave me the address, and I thanked her before hanging up. It wasn't much, but it was something. Noah and I spent the next few hours trying to track Grace down online. The address Lauren gave me led to an old apartment complex in San Diego, but there was no sign of her living there anymore. We tried searching her name on social media, but with no last name to go on, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Just when I was about to give up, Noah stumbled across a local news article from a few years ago. It was about a woman named Grace who had started a nonprofit for young mothers in California. The article mentioned her full name, Grace Ellison, and even included a photo. "That's her," I said, staring at the screen. She looked older than I'd imagined, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and lines around her eyes, but there was something warm about her smile. "She's still in San Diego," Noah said, pointing to the address of her nonprofit. "You going to reach out?" I nodded, my heart pounding. "Yeah, I have to." I sent Grace an email that night, keeping it short and to the point. I told her who I was, that I'd found her letters, and that I wanted to talk to her about what had happened. I didn't expect a response, not right away, anyway, but to my surprise, she replied within hours. "Mason, I never thought I'd hear from you, or anyone connected to Jack, after all these years. I'm willing to meet and talk, but this isn't an easy conversation. If you're sure you want answers, come to the address below. Grace." She included the address of her nonprofit, and I immediately started making plans to drive to San Diego. Noah offered to come with me, but I needed to do this alone. The next day, I made the 6-hour drive, my nerves fraying with every mile. What if she didn't want to talk? What if she was angry? What if I found out something I wasn't ready to hear? By the time I pulled into the parking lot of her nonprofit, a modest building with a small sign that read Grace's Place, support for young mothers, I felt like I was going to throw up. Grace greeted me at the door, her expression cautious but kind. "Mason," she said, extending a hand. "It's nice to meet you." "You too," I said, shaking her hand. She led me inside to a small office, where we sat across from each other at a wooden desk. The room was simple but welcoming, with photos of smiling women and children on the walls. "You look like him," she said after a moment, her eyes studying my face. I shifted uncomfortably. "That's probably not a compliment." Grace smiled faintly. "Jack wasn't all bad," she said, "but I understand why you might feel that way." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I cut straight to the point. "I need to know the truth," I said. "About you. About him. About the baby." Her expression softened. "I'll tell you everything," she said, "but it's a long story." Grace told me about how she and my dad had met in college, how they'd fallen in love despite their differences. She was studying social work. He was studying business. They'd been inseparable for years, even getting engaged after graduation. But when she found out she was pregnant, everything changed. "Jack was scared," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "And his parents, your grandparents, they made it clear that a baby didn't fit into their vision for his future. They pressured him to convince me to give the baby up." "And you agreed?" I asked, struggling to keep the judgment out of my voice. Grace sighed. It wasn't that simple. I wanted to keep him. God. I wanted that more than anything. But Jack was my whole world back then, and he swore it was the only way we could have a future together. So I did it. I gave him up. She paused, her eyes glistening. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And Jack, he left not long after. Married your mom. Moved on with his life. I sat there, trying to process everything. What happened to the baby? I asked finally. Grace reached into a drawer and pulled out a folder. She handed it to me, and I opened it to find an old photo of a newborn boy, along with some papers. He was adopted by a family in Arizona, she said. I've thought about reaching out to him a million times, but I didn't want to disrupt his life. I stared at the photo, my chest tightening. This was my brother. My older brother. I didn't even know his name, but he was out there somewhere, living a life I'd never been part of. Do you know anything about him now? I asked. Grace shook her head. No, I haven't tried to contact him. I didn't think it was my place. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Finally, Grace reached across the desk and took my hand. I'm sorry, Mason, she said, for everything, for what Jack put you through. You didn't deserve to be dragged into this. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. It's not your fault, I said. But thank you. That night, I drove back home, my head spinning with everything Grace had told me. I didn't know what I was going to do next, but one thing was certain. My dad was going to answer for what he'd done. I pulled into the driveway late that night, unsure what I'd find waiting for me. My dad's car was parked out front, his office light glowing dimly through the downstairs window. For a moment, I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the house that suddenly felt like a stranger's. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been turned on its head in just a few days. The picture-perfect life my dad had constructed was a lie, and I wasn't sure if I could ever see him the same way again. But there was no turning back. I wasn't going to let him bury the truth any longer. When I walked inside, my mom was sitting in the living room, wrapped in a blanket with a half-empty glass of wine on the coffee table. She looked up when she saw me, her face a mixture of relief and apprehension. Mason, she said, setting the glass down. Where have you been? I went to see Grace, I said bluntly, dropping my bag on the floor. I didn't miss the way her face fell at the mention of the name. She took a deep breath. I suppose it was only a matter of time. Did you know? I asked, my voice quieter now. Did you know about her? About the baby? My mom hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the blanket. I knew about Grace, she admitted. Jack told me when we first started dating. He said they'd broken up and that she was part of his past. But I didn't know about the baby until much later. How much later? I pressed. She looked away, guilt written all over her face. After Ava was born, I found an old letter she sent him. He swore it didn't matter, that it was all behind him. I didn't push. I thought it was better to let it stay buried. I stared at her, struggling to reconcile the mom I'd always trusted with the person sitting in front of me. So you've been covering for him this whole time? I didn't see it that way, she said quietly. I was trying to protect our family. Protect us from what? The truth? I shook my head, my frustration bubbling over. You're just as complicit as he is. Before she could respond, my dad's voice cut through the room. That's enough. I turned to see him standing in the doorway to his office, his arms crossed and his expression stern. He looked like he was trying to maintain control, but there was a tension in his posture I'd never seen before. You want to talk? Fine, he said. Let's talk. But you're not going to stand here and attack your mother. I took a step toward him, my anger boiling over. I'm not attacking her. I'm calling both of you out for lying to us for years. For lying to me. I didn't lie, he said, his voice firm. I made mistakes. Big ones. But I did what I thought was right at the time. Right? I laughed bitterly. You abandoned Grace. You abandoned your own son. And you have the nerve to lecture me about responsibility? My dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. My mom stood up, her hands trembling. Jack, maybe it's time you tell him everything. There's nothing else to tell, he snapped. but I could see the cracks in his armor. He was unraveling, just like the perfect image he'd spent years projecting. Grace told me what happened, I said, stepping closer. She told me about the adoption, about how you chose your reputation over your family, how you convinced her to give up her baby so you wouldn't have to deal with the consequences. His face paled, and for a moment, he looked like he might deny it. But then he let out a heavy sigh and sank into the armchair. You don't understand, he said, his voice low. I was young, scared. My parents, they gave me an ultimatum. Either I gave up the baby, or they cut me off. I thought I was doing the right thing. For everyone, the right thing? I repeated, my voice rising. You think it was the right thing to abandon your child and let Grace deal with the fallout alone? I didn't know what else to do, he said, his voice cracking. I wasn't ready to be a father. I wasn't ready for any of it. And yet you've spent my entire life judging me for not living up to your standards, I said. Do you even realize how hypocritical that is? He didn't respond. For the first time in my life, my dad looked small, like a man who had no idea how to fix the mess he'd created. The next few days were tense. My dad retreated to his office, avoiding the rest of us as much as possible. My mom tried to smooth things over, but there was no going back to the way things were. The truth had shattered our family, and the pieces didn't fit together anymore. Ava took it the hardest. She cornered me in the kitchen one night, her eyes red from crying. Why didn't anyone tell me? She asked, her voice trembling. I'm not a little kid. I could have handled it. I don't think Dad wanted anyone to know, I said. Not even himself. She shook her head, wiping her eyes. It's just, how do we move on from this? How do we trust him again? I don't know, I admitted, but I'm not sure it's about trusting him. It's about figuring out how to move forward, even if he's not the man we thought he was. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about my brother. Grace had given me enough information to start looking for him, but I wasn't sure if I had the right to reach out. He had a life of his own, and I didn't want to disrupt it. But then I thought about how much I'd wanted answers, how much it had meant to me to learn the truth. If I had a brother out there, he deserved the chance to know the truth, too. With Grace's blessing, I started the process of reaching out to him. It wasn't easy. There were lawyers, adoption agencies, and endless hoops to jump through. But eventually, I got a name, Logan. The first time I met Logan, I felt like I was looking at a stranger and a reflection all at once. He had my dad's sharp features, but Grace's warm smile. He was tall, confident, and easygoing in a way I could never be. We met at a coffee shop, both of us nervous but eager to talk. Logan had known he was adopted, but he'd never known much about his birth parents. When I told him about Grace, about our dad, about everything, he listened quietly, taking it all in. I always wondered, he said finally, who they were, why they gave me up. I guess I have my answers now. I'm sorry, I said, for everything, for how they treated you, for how long it took to find you. He smiled faintly. Don't apologize. It's not your fault. And honestly, I'm just glad to know you. That meeting with Logan was the first step towards something new, something better. My family might never be the same, but I wasn't alone anymore. Logan, Grace, Ava. We were all connected by the fractures in our lives, but we were stronger for it. As for my dad, I didn't know if I'd ever fully forgive him. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let his mistakes define me. I was going to build my own life, my own family on my own terms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free.